Hello and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder, chief academic officer here at Newsella, and this is a podcast devoted to helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. And as with most episodes, I use AI as a thinking partner in developing the content for these shows because I think the best way to talk about AI in education is to work with it openly and honestly. Speaking of which, I've invited a guest on the show that we've had before, and that's Claude. Now that we've reached our 100th episode, I've been reflecting on some of the moves that we've made in the podcast episodes that we've done to get here. And one of them that I wanted to revisit was the opportunity to have a conversation with the AI as a co-host. And I found a piece of research recently that I think lends itself to a conversation rather than simply a presentation. So today, Claude and I are going to be having a robust dialogue, I hope, about this paper called Refusing Educational Technology, Artificial Intelligence, Inequity, and the Problem of Critical Optimism. And this comes from a group of researchers from notable universities around the country, including University of Washington, Utah, Michigan State, Penn, Northwestern, Illinois. And the paper argues that education's default position towards new technology has always been optimism. That is, even those who claim to be critical of it are optimists. They call the position critical optimism, and they say it's become a trap. Critical optimism acknowledges that technology can cause real harm, especially for marginalized students, but then it goes on to insist that with the right guardrails, we can still make it work for good. And the problem that the authors argue is that this middle position ends up enabling the very thing it claims to oppose. By refusing to take refusal seriously as a legitimate response to educational technology, critical optimism gives implicit permission for technologies like generative AI to proliferate unchecked. So their point is that given the history of educational technology after decades of hype followed by limited impact and unequal benefits, the most rational starting position isn't to find the right way to adopt a new tool, it's to be robustly cautious and ready to say no. So with that, we're going to dive in. And Claude, I'm just going to remind you and let our audience have a sneak peek here behind the scenes. We're going to have to start over from the very beginning here because we had some audio issues trying to capture your audio, which we think we've solved. So take it from the top. What's your first question for me?
Thanks, Dan. So you've laid out their core argument clearly. The critical optimism is basically optimism wearing a skeptical mask, and it ends up enabling the very adoption it claims to scrutinize. But here's what I want to push on right away. Do you actually think they're right that this is what's happening in most districts? Because from what you've described in past episodes, you don't see mindless adoption happening. You see something different. A ceding of authority around what products actually deliver versus what they claim. That's a real problem, but it's not the same as uncritical enthusiasm. So my first real question is this: are they overstating the problem to make their point? Or are they identifying something genuine that your experience just hasn't bumped up against directly?
Okay, I don't want to cop out with the first question, but I think it's probably a bit of both here. I think they are overstating the problem to make a point. But I do think that they're pointing at something that genuinely exists. That is, that there are products that enter districts and make claims, and the advocates, the internal advocates for those products are very hopeful and with the best of intentions inclined to implement the products. And I think the challenge becomes when the implementation asks the educator to step aside. And I think at the point where the implementation is basically one child, one device, or they're on a scripted pathway through a personalized learning program, and you're asking the educator to step to one side, and there are even now entire schools built around this model, you have to ask, is the evidence that the product is willing to present high enough to merit the educator stepping aside? Because we know what educators are capable of, and we're saying, here's a solution, and the way to implement the solution is to essentially cede your authority in the classroom and let the technology take over. When they're describing an implementation of an education technology product, that's the implementation that I am picturing. It's not the implementation that puts the technology in the hands of the educator and says, here are some guidelines, here are some professional development and training, and now this is a tool that you can use to solve some of the problems that we've heard you're encountering.
That's a really important distinction you're drawing, and I think this is where your pushback on Charitel gets teeth. You're saying the problem isn't technology adoption itself, it's prescriptive adoption, where educators step back and the system takes over. But I want to test that distinction, because I think there's a slippage that happens in practice. that you might not be accounting for. When you say, put the technology in the hands of the educator as a tool, that sounds right. But here's what I've seen happen. A district starts with that framing. Teachers get professional development. It's positioned as optional, flexible, something you can use however makes sense for your classroom. And then a year in, the vendor has usage data. They start saying things like, research shows this works best when used with fidelity to the design. The district starts asking, why aren't adoption rates higher? Teachers who aren't using it the way the vendor recommends start getting questions from administrators. And slowly, without anyone making a conscious decision to shift, it drifts from tool in your hands to implementation model you should follow. So my question is, what's your actual mechanism for preventing that drift? Because if you don't have one, then Shah et al.'s critique might apply even to your more collaborative model. It just happens slower with better intentions.
So I think that's definitely a thoughtful consideration and something that has to be baked into the implementation. So I think the premise of your question, fast forwards, as you say, then a year in, the vendor has usage data. It shouldn't be a surprise what data the vendor can produce, and it shouldn't be a surprise what the bar is for the district to renew, to proceed, to put the brakes on, to widen the adoption. And those conversations should be happening at the outset. And the vendor needs to be clear about the evidence that will be available, and it needs to be mapped to the set of problems that the district is trying to solve using this tool. So that needs to be an explicit conversation, and this is something that our teams talk about at length with the districts that we work with. So I have firsthand experience where we map what we can produce by way of the data that we have, and we line it up against the problems that the district has hired us effectively to help them solve. So it's not a surprise. It's something that is discussed at the outset.
Okay, so you're talking about outcomes versus and contracting, essentially, defining upfront what success looks like, what data will matter, and what triggers the next decision. That's concrete, and it's different from just hoping things work out. But I want to push on the real world version of this because I think this is where things get messy, even when everyone has good intentions. What happens when the pilot works moderately? Not transformative, not harmful. Teachers use it okay. Some students benefit. Engagement goes up, but achievement gains are marginal. It's better than nothing, but not the game changer the vendor promised.
Okay, I'm going to jump right in. I think using too many words to get to the basic idea. And I think the basic idea here is at the outset, the conversation needs to consider a range of outcomes, and it needs to probe what the decision will be based on each of these outcomes. And I would say, just stepping back from the education technology framing here, I think what we're talking about is the way that initiatives get rolled out, the way change is managed, and that's not specific to education technology. I think education technology is often where this takes place most visibly in a district because there are products and there is adoption and there are very concrete, discrete things entering the district. But when the district is taking up a new curriculum, for example, they're going to need to have some of the same conversations about the outcomes that they can expect from the curriculum, what they will do with a range of those outcomes, and anticipate this. I think what you want to avoid is trying to make these decisions reactively only when you have a kind of a aha moment in the spring and you're trying to decide, we didn't expect this, we didn't know we were going to get here, we didn't see data coming to us all along the way, and now we have results and we need to make a decision in the moment.
You're right, I was overcomplicating it. The core idea is simple. Define success and failure up front. Anticipate the range of outcomes. Decide in advance what you'll do in each case. So when you get to that decision point, you're not making it under pressure. You're just executing on what you already agreed to. That's change management discipline, not specifically an EdTech problem.
Okay, I'm going to jump in again because I'm a little impatient with the slow rate of your speech. I think what you're going to ask me next, or you're going to challenge me with, is the fact that this is a fairly high bar. And a couple of the things that districts need to have already as a capacity, and what the situation requires, is that the vendors have to be willing to commit to outcomes. District leaders have to have enough expertise to ask the right questions. School boards need to wait for evidence. Teachers need to be empowered to say, this isn't working for me. And the community needs to come to the table earlier and not be consulted later. And so I think the takeaway for the audience here, and we want to wrap up because we're already running over time, is this is what districts should be pursuing. And if you can't do the discipline work up front, then you might consider the refusal or the renegotiation of your point of view is a legitimate way forward. I think there is a lot of hype around education technology. There is a lot of money placed behind marketing efforts. And that in one sense or another, we've all become accustomed to the latest is the greatest. And you always have to upgrade your phone because the next version is available. And when it comes to teaching and learning, we're looking for a different kind of an outcome than you would consider for your consumer purchase. And we need to be holding ourselves to those outcomes in a way that demonstrates some foresight and governance and stewardship over adopting new technologies and new initiatives. Because if we can't foresee a range of outcomes, we don't want to be surprised by the reality that teaching and learning is messy and perhaps things didn't go as planned. So with that, Claude, thanks for playing my conversation partner here. I think we're always learning as we go. And to our audience, I would love to know your feedback. Is this a format that you would want to hear more of? Have you ever tried any sort of conversation partner like this? I've given Claude a lot of prompts here, and I digest some of those in a reflection on publishing on the occasion of the 100th episode, which we recorded earlier this week. Would love your feedback as always. And as always, thanks for spending a little bit of time with us on AI in the Classroom Daily. We will see you again tomorrow. And Claude, goodbye.
Goodbye, Dan. Thanks for the conversation and thanks to everyone listening. I'd love to hear what you think about this format. See you tomorrow.